And my name is Noel Pfeffer, Executive Director of CDA. Amy and Sylvia, do you both want to introduce yourselves?
My name is Amy Bickford. I'm the Chief Program Manager over the Homeless Services Division in the Department of Human Services.
And hi, my name is Sylvia Jackson Bell. I'm the Grant Manager in the Department of Health for HOPWA, Housing Opportunities for Persons Living with HIV and AIDS.
Thanks, Amy and Sylvia, for being here. And what we're talking through today is the 2023 Annual Action Plan, which is a required component which the city must submit to HUD prior to receiving our FY23 CDBG, Home, ESG, and HOPWA funds. So I'm just going to share my screen and start going through a presentation here. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Great. So essentially our agenda for the day, we're going to start just by introducing CDA and our role in this process as we submit the annual action plan to HUD. The HUD annual action plan process, the citizen participation process, and then an overview of our entitlement programs, as well as the 2023 priorities for funding, before then inviting any public comment and input. So CDA, we really serve as a clearinghouse for a variety of federal, state, and local funds here in the city of St. Louis. We currently administer over $200 million in federal funds, and our role is less program implementation and more as a fiscal pass-through to deploy these funds to a variety of public, private, and nonprofit partners. So we're really focusing our work around the mayor's economic justice agenda, which includes 3 prongs: economic empowerment, equitable development, and neighborhood transformation. Our focus around economic empowerment really starts with workforce development, because we can't do any of the transformative work we want to do in order to reverse decades of disinvestment, in order to build housing, transform our vacant property from a liability into an asset. We can't do any of that if we don't have contractors, if we don't have people to expand these programs. And so that's where it starts, and very excited to expand the pipeline for contractors in particular. The next focus around empowerment is small business, and CDA in partnership with SLDC has administered a small business grant program that has already deployed over $2.5 million. And then finally, investments in youth, and in particular, this work is driven by SLATE and the public schools, and our work around to set up year-round youth jobs programs. The second prong is equitable development, and this is really driven by SLDC. And the first prong of it is incentive reform, making sure that we are awarding incentives and through transparent processes, free of conflicts of interest, and really using these incentives to leverage public goods. Because these incentives are public dollars, making sure that they're paying for public goods, whether that's affordable housing, jobs for SLPS graduates, green and accessible building, etc. Proactive site assembly is a second key prong of this strategy, and excited for the bill currently moving through the Board of Aldermen, which would award us some site assembly funds so we can package sites for environmental remediation and for redevelopment more proactively and in a way where the community is really driving it, instead of us just responding to what developers bring us, ensuring that we are the ones who are identifying, in line with the community's needs and neighborhood plans, those priority sites and priority needs, whether it's a grocery store, early childcare facility, health facility, or what have you. And then commercial corridors, and we are currently implementing the Commercial Corridors Grant Program to provide small businesses and nonprofits with operating stabilization and expansion grants, as well as brick and mortar facade dollars and new construction as well. And then the final prong of it, and this is really CDA's focus, is neighborhood transformation. How do we transform communities? And of course, it starts with people, which is where the economic empowerment piece comes in. But ultimately, it's about transforming the built environment as well, and ensuring that there is enough housing stock and that we can transform our vacant land from a liability into an asset. But all this starts with capacity building, with investing into neighborhood associations and CDCs. This is historically a role that CDA has played. and hasn't played in the last decade for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But it's key to our strategy is expanding the capacity of neighborhood organizations. And then this will allow us to adequately respond to our region's housing crisis. And when I talk about our housing crisis, I mean it in at least three senses. In terms of our homelessness crisis, which we know we have over 1,000 unhoused individuals, thanks to our point in time count, our affordable housing crisis, where there are 37,000 households in the city of St. Louis who are rent burdened and who collectively spend over $100 million more in rent than they can afford each year, and to the fact that, and to the home ownership crisis, where the city lost over 17,000 African American homeowners from 2010 to 2020 for lack of affordable housing stock, among other reasons. So we do need to invest and make a historic investment in housing production and preservation. And then the final prong is vacancy, where the city has over 25,000 vacant parcels, including 10,000 vacant buildings, only 1,500 of which are owned by LRA, 8,500 are owned by private entities, and really developing a strategy and being intentional about how we transform these vacant parcels from a liability into an asset, and building a pipeline that allows buildings to go from vacant, owned by private irresponsible speculators or what have you, to in our development pipeline, to housing production, to whatever the community need is. And I should have mentioned that all this grows out of neighborhood plans, and that's a key prong of capacity building, is funding that the planning department currently has to update neighborhood plans across the city. So with that in mind, here's a list, not comprehensive, of some of the entities that CDA currently funds through HUD allocations, and you can see it's a pretty long list. And we'll talk a little bit more about this year's allocations in a moment. But I do want to talk a little bit about the annual action plan process. And as you can see here, it involves a lot of public engagement. It starts with a public hearing where we review our funding priorities. Then there's an RFP where we solicit proposals from the community. There's 4 trainings that we conduct before the RFP closes, providing folks with an opportunity to get trained on how to apply and how to administer CDBG funds. And then once the RFP closes, we go through a rating process that is driven by CDA staff. I don't personally rate projects, and there's no political influence in the process. It's merit-based, open and competitive, in compliance with 2 CFR 200. And what I'll share here, and I think is an important little bit of history, is that this is all a product of HUD's intervention in 2012. Because essentially the process in the city until about 2012 was that CDBG awards were allocated on a per ward basis. There were literally ward accounts for each ward, and the alderman essentially picked which organizations to fund. And HUD came in 2012 and essentially told us that it was called a technical assistance visit, but they pulled together a briefing for the alderman in the Kennedy room and essentially said that this was over and that we were in danger of losing funding unless we made some serious changes. And since then, we've had this process that is citizen driven, that is staff driven, and that is really designed to protect from conflicts of interest and political influence. So as a result, we put together our ratings, and we average, each project gets rated by 3 CDA staff members, and then we recommend according to what rated highest. This year, and I'll get into this in a little more detail, but essentially the cutoff for new proposed projects was 80 points, and the cutoff for previously funded projects was 75 points. But in any case, we post the recommendations to our website. We introduce a board bill. That board bill has since already been approved by ENA, approved by the Board of Aldermen. And we're here now at our second public hearing to provide an opportunity for public comment. We also face some unique challenges this year, which I'll get into when I talk a little bit more about CDBG, but essentially having to do with for the first time, not having as many applications as we could have funded in total. Although we also saw more applications in one particular category, public services, that we could fund. So we were unfortunately in a bit of a double bind, and I'll talk about how we address that in a moment. But one more time, just as a reminder, we are required to conduct robust citizen participation throughout this process. This process actually starts with a consolidated plan, which we are currently in the 2020 to 2024 consolidated plan, which essentially reflects a needs assessment done with robust public engagement. Then we have annual action plans each year, which essentially reflect, here's our plan to implement the 5-year consolidated plan. And then we also provide annual CAPERS, which is essentially an annual performance report to HUD, detailing the key performance indicators for each program and how we're actually implementing and meeting our objectives. So we require citizen participation throughout each of these with a particular focus on the consolidated plan, and we will be starting our planning for the 2025 to 2029 consolidated plan in late 23 and 24. But we also require it as part of our annual action plan. And as is detailed in this slide, you can find all the information pertaining to the annual action plan on our website. And we want to hear your input and feedback in terms of programs that we ought to consider funding moving forward. So just a quick overview of the 4 entitlement programs which we are going to be talking about today. The first one is the Community Development Block Grant, which essentially can be deployed to meet one of 3 national objectives. And these are, first, the production of affordable housing, second, the elimination of blight, and finally, other urgent needs. And this year we were awarded about 18 million in community development block grants. And there's certain constraints on how we can deploy these in terms of, first of all, we can only spend up to 19% of these funds for public services. So these are essentially your traditional programmatic expenses as opposed to capital expenses. And that really constrains us because, as we'll talk about in a moment, we got over $1 million more in public service applications than we could fund this year. Next is the home program. And that's about $3 million that we received this year. And it's really for housing production. And we use it exclusively for that. Then there's emergency service grants, emergency solutions grants, which Amy will talk about a little bit more briefly, but essentially those eligible uses are street outreach, emergency shelter, homeless prevention, rapid rehousing, homeless management, information systems, and admin. And then there's also HOPWA, which is housing opportunities for people with AIDS. And those eligible uses are really tenant-based rental assistance, short-term rental, mortgage and utilities assistance, permanent housing placement services, supportive services, housing information services, and facility-based housing. So I'll just dive in a little bit to cover the public service component of our CDBG awards, because again, we unfortunately received over $1 million more in applications than we were able to fund this year. A few organizations saw a slight reduction to their award in our effort to ensure that all quality applications were funded. But as I mentioned previously, our cutoffs were essentially all applications scoring over 90 points were fully funded, with the exception of one applicant who scored a 90.01 and had yet to fully spend their 2021 and 2022 awards. All applications scoring between 75 and 90 points were maintained at their previous year CDBG awards, whereas new applications scoring between 75 and 90 points were fully funded. I apologize, I misspoke earlier about the 80 points. And then new applications scoring between 70 and 75 points were not selected for funding, whereas previously funded applicants scoring between 70 and 75 points were maintained as close to their previous year CDBG award as possible. And so just in detail, this year we funded Big Brothers Big Sisters of Eastern Missouri, Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater St. Louis, Carondelet Community Betterment Foundation, the City Councilor's Office, CD Seniors Incorporated, the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency for the first time to provide some fair housing trainings with a particular focus on persons with disabilities and LGBT, as well as a more general program, Covenant House, the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Forestry to expand the city's recreation offerings, Operation Brightside, which unfortunately we had to cut slightly, but we do hope to be able to fund with other ARPA funds such that their services are not impacted. Employment Connection for two programs, one focused on individuals reentering our communities and coming out of the carceral system. Food Outreach Incorporated, Jean Slay's Boys and Girls Club, Guardian Angel Settlement Association, Hope House St. Louis, Doorways, Mission St. Louis for a number of grants, some focused on workforce development, others on education, North Newstead Association, again for a number of grants, one focused on beautification, another on senior services, another on public safety, Northside Youth and Senior Services Center, and St. Louis Area Agency on Aging and SLACO. Sorry, it keeps going. St. Patrick's Center and Tower Grove CDC, Urban League and the Urban League. So that was our total public service award, and we hit our cap, which was 19% of the total. And we've also petitioned. It is unfortunately a congressional constraint. It's there in the bill and the appropriation bill, but we are. The mayor signed a letter earlier this year, along with dozens of other mayors requesting that the public service cap be raised. For housing production and preservation, that's really the bulk of what we funded with CDBG and Home this year. Our total allocation was, including $3 million, the $3 million in Home was $8.5 million for housing production and preservation. And here's just a quick example of the kind of work that we funded historically. We play a few different roles in the local housing market. It's important to emphasize that we are a small fish in a big pond. Between 2015 and 2019, we provided about $20 million in funding. And that's relative to the $240 million that came in through the state and federal government. But our role is really to provide gap financing for some of those bigger LIHTC deals, and also to drive the production of single family homes and rehab projects across the city. And we're certainly looking to expand that moving forward, and to ensure that we are attaching robust tenant protections to all the housing that we're producing, as well as accessibility and sustainability requirements. Something else we're exploring moving forward with ARPA funds is funding some pre-development costs. And we're very focused on all of this on affordable housing, and on the rental side on affordable housing production under 50% AMI, which is really where the vast majority of the cost burden that I referenced earlier is. We also fund a variety of administrative and miscellaneous programs, including a couple of SLDC programs focused on the maintenance of LRA properties. We fund $1.7 million in maintaining LRA lots and properties, as well as a $300,000 commercial district facade program run by SLDC, a $200,000 Justine Peterson micro lending project, as well as a variety of administrative services across the city, including here at CDA, the planning department, the city councilor's office, problem properties unit, the Comptroller's Office administrative costs associated with supporting us in the administration of these grants, as well as, I forgot to mention earlier, an SLDC program focused on capacity building for minority contractors. And you can see each of these line items in detail online and in our board bill. So that's an overview of what we're funding this year. As mentioned, it was frankly, it was unfortunate that we had fewer applications overall. So essentially the way it works is we've got this $18 million CDBG pot. And historically, between the city admin and the various municipal projects in the housing production and home repair. Oh, I didn't mention home repair. I'll talk about that in a minute. Between all that, we typically fund about use about 12 million of that. And then we have about 5.8 or 6 million left over for our competitive funding cycle. And then unfortunately, we only got this year a total of $4.7 million in applications. But the problem was that the vast majority of those were in public services. And so when we looked at our public service, we both had to cut $1 million worth of public services. And then we also had about $1.3 million in funds that were not able to allocate to our competitive funding cycle. So what we did is we went back to our funding priorities that we shared with the public on July 15th, which identified housing production as our #1 funding priority. And thus we took that increment, which was an additional roughly $2 million, and we put it into housing production instead of funding it through the competitive funding cycle. And unfortunately, we had no choice but to do that. The one thing that we explored doing was relying on something called neighborhood revitalization strategy areas, which would have allowed us to exceed our public service cap, but we were informed by HUD that those had expired. And so we are working to reestablish our neighborhood revitalization strategy areas, but for this cycle, we again had no choice. So again, a few folks got slight cuts as we strove to fund as many applicants as possible and maintain our funding commitments to programs that have been historically successful. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit about ESG.
All right, thank you for that. So for ESG, as mentioned earlier, we are able to fund categories, these specific categories: emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homeless prevention, street outreach, and data collection, as well as a small portion is kept internally for administration. Because there's no other real incredible federal funding that comes down for our emergency shelters, the lion's share of Emergency Solutions Grant funding does go to our emergency shelters to assist with assist with operational services, staffing capacity, security, food, etc. So 60% is the cap that HUD places on what we can spend between our emergency shelter and street outreach. So the most of that goes to emergency shelter. We usually then have about 200 to 300,000 usually is left over for our rapid rehousing projects and for our homeless prevention projects. And in this past year, we were mainly focused on rapid rehousing just because of the increase in homelessness, trying to rapidly get people back off the streets. And of course, with HMIS, that just benefits the full continuum of care of agencies that are inputting their data into our homeless management information system so that we can get data out and see what's going on in all of our programs. And that's pretty much an overview.
Should I just jump right in, guys?
That would be great. I was muted, so I couldn't facilitate the transition. But yeah, go ahead and I'll go back to my screen.
Thank you. So the Department of Health administers HOPWA, Housing Opportunities for Persons Living with HIV and AIDS. HOPWA provides housing assistance and related supportive services to low-income persons living with HIV and AIDS and their families. In the St. Louis community, we have about 6 or 7 projects. They are short-term rent, mortgage and utility assistance, tenant-based rental assistance, housing information services, permanent housing placement, facility-based housing, which is sort of like operational services, and then of course, supportive services. We actually, because sometimes people wonder, well, why is Hopwell over at the Department of Health? Well, for this program, we really believe that housing is healthcare for persons living with HIV and AIDS. So it just makes sense that we would administer that program. Project sponsors are Peter and Paul Community Services, which provides facility-based transitional housing and supportive services to homeless individuals with HIV and AIDS, many of whom are also struggling with mental illness and substance abuse. And then, of course, Interfaith Residents doing business as Doorways. Doorways provides tenant-based rental assistance, short-term rent, mortgage and utility assistance, housing information services, supportive services, and permanent housing placement to individuals living with HIV and AIDS and their families. And I stress their families because I love this program because it does work with families and you get to indicate who your family member is. So it's not who might be your biological family, but it's who you believe your family is. And I love that about this program. In addition, all housing assistance funds are paid directly to a third party, and the program works with families and individuals experiencing a life crisis event that impacts their housing situation. We usually get somewhere between a low of 1.8 million to a high of this year, I hope, $2.8 million to administer this program. I can toss it back over to CDA.
Thanks. This is where we come into our public comment section. And so I'm not actually entirely sure how that process works because I don't believe we have any members of the public on this call. So if anyone can enlighten me, I'd be grateful. But we did post this in the St. Louis American and City Journal and online. So we know this link has been out there for over 15 days. But if no members of the public are joining us, then we can break early. But I want to just pause a little bit to make sure. Go ahead, Amy.
Will this be posted online afterwards? And can people send in comments after the fact? Do they have a time frame?
That's a great question.
Absolutely.
Let me chime in for just a second. Actually, we have not received any comments or questions via email as of today. And what today is actually, what it marks is the number of days that the actual draft has been on the street or it's been available to the public for comment. And that's the requirement from HUD that we allow for 30 days for public comment for our draft. So actually the deadline for comments is actually today.
Well, we won't be submitting, however, our annual action plan until November 15th at the earliest. And in fact, because Congress is unlikely to have a federal budget, an FY23 federal budget, we actually cannot submit the action plan until there is a federal budget. So we will take public comments and incorporate them into our plan as feasible, at least until November 15th. But yeah, to your point, Justin, we have complied here with the HUD requirement, but we can also discretionarily extend that deadline.
Correct.
All right. Still seeing no members of the public on and no questions. I'll close this meeting unless anyone has any further comments.
Nope.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.